Welcome to the MacMillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Nobuhiro Hiwatari, who is a visiting fellow at the Council on East Asian Studies at the MacMillan Center. He is a professor of international political economy at the University of Tokyo. Professor Hiwatari's research interests are the party politics of neoliberal reforms at OECD countries, as well as the impact of political regime heterogeneity on economic cooperation in the Asian Pacific region. His work on these topics have appeared in academic journals as well as edited volumes. Today we'll talk with Professor Hiwatari about his paper on the politics of fiscal discipline. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start with an overview of your project. Tell us about it.
Yeah, well, it's a bit difficult in abstract terms, but it's basically, it talks about the compatibility of democratic politics, democratic political processes, democratic government, and the global economy, adjusting to the global economy.
Okay.
And I always sense that there's some kind of tension between the two. Especially a lot of voters find a disconnect between what the leaders do and what they prefer to see.
Right.
And for instance, you can see that a lot of voters will see their leaders' hands tied by the global economy. If you look at the elections in recent Europe, you will see a lot of people saying that, well, it's Germany's fault, it's the European Central Bank's fault, and our leaders are basically captured by these people. So there's this problem of a kind of disconnect, and there's also, if you look at the recent campaign process in the United States, you can see a lot of talk about trade, and trade not really benefiting the people of the voters. So I was wondering if there's really this big disconnect between the leaders and the people or the voters, and whether that would mean what that means to the democratic process, whether the global economy is harming or undermining the democratic process, or whether we can somehow muddle through the process and have a democratic adjustment to the process, to the political policy.
So how do you go about determining that? What kind of methodology did you employ to figure this out?
Right. Well, I used a couple of things. Number one, I look at the data. It's called the manifesto data, and it's usually what politicians say, what parties say actually during elections. And what I found interesting about this is that political parties, especially what I call mainstream parties, the parties that are really competing for power, not the kind of niche parties or the radical parties, but the mainstream parties, the old parties, traditional parties in Japan, in Europe, in the United States, basically move rightwards after a recession. Meaning rightwards, meaning that they tend to advocate more or less market-assuring policies, the policies that people would associate with, with global markets, with big banks and fiscal financial markets, but they tend to move in that direction.
Becoming more conservative.
Becoming more conservative, economically conservative, not socially conservative, but economically conservative.
Yes.
And then they tend to move backwards after the economy takes off. So the idea here is that, or the intuition I got from here is that basically that politicians really talk about what is necessary for the economy to recover. And then when there's when the economy actually recovers, they can talk more about addressing social problems, about unemployment or inequality. But so it's not as pessimistic as the kind of disconnect argument, that there is some kind of, and what struck me is, well, why do politicians do this? Why do they advocate it? Why do they what I call engage in policy straight talk? Why do they actually tell what needs to be done And you can see that again in Greece or in any countries that they say that, well, we have to tighten our belts, we can't run a deficit forever, etc., etc. And I think that the explanation I found for that is basically that voters expect politicians not just to represent their values or their preferences, but they also expect politicians to be competent. And be competent meaning that they know how to run the economy, or we can actually delegate our powers of government, our reins of government to these people so that they can run the economy safely. Now, that doesn't mean that there's no disconnect, but it means that at least the leaders are willing to not actually take a populist view, not actually to cater to the voters, and saying that, well, we can solve these problems easily, but that they have to say that, well, this is a hard thing that we have to go through. So that's one part of my findings. The other part I'm finding is that the actual policies are probably determined not so much as the leader's party position, but basically the position of the legislature itself after the election. And that implies that the leaders make concessions. They make concessions from moderate dissidents within their party, if it's a strong party organization. They can make concessions to the opposition, or at least open with the opposition. If they don't reach an agreement, they can always co-opt part of those views. So in that, what the importance of that is that basically that the actual policies or actual policy changes represent the position of what is usually called the legislative mean, the kind of middle of the legislature, which probably represents the middle of the voters. So in that sense, fiscal reforms in general, but also I'm looking to social reforms now. It's a part of a big project that I'm trying to finish, do represent the people. So that's the kind of...
Okay. So your theory is somewhat unique. Tell us about why.
Well, it's usual, the way this issue has been discussed is usually by looking into institutional factors, how institutions work, how the system works. What I try to put into that or add to that is the way politicians think.
Okay.
And I look at politicians, especially leaders, as those, of course, who want to survive in power. They want to
So
win
what
power.
leaders did you look at?
Excuse me?
Which leaders did you look at?
Basically, party leaders, mainstream party leaders. That's why the mainstream party leaders are those who want to win power.
Okay, so in terms of the past 10 years, or what kind of data span?
Yes, it goes from, my data goes from 1975. So it's just shortly after the oil crisis. And that's when you have reliable data on economic indicators. The manifesto project itself goes from the post-war period for most countries, but that's the period I'm looking into. And this is a period when you have increasing so-called globalization, or in my case, I'm looking especially or particularly in the financial markets, the world of financial markets, and how they discipline governments, or how the governments have to adjust to the volatilities of financial markets.
And you were looking basically Japan, Europe, United States, any other countries or areas?
It's basically, it's a 20-country comparison. So it's basically Europe and mostly the old Europe. So unfortunately, I haven't got Greece in that sample, but it's basically the major countries of Europe: United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Japan. 20 countries. Okay,
great. So do your findings apply to the recession of 2008?
I like to claim it does.
Okay. Tell us about it.
And so when you see the right after the 2008 recession, you can see a lot of governments easing their monetary policy, enacting a fiscal stimulus. So it might contradict the idea that, well, politicians advocate these responsible policies, restraint, fiscal restraint, or try to keep inflation down. But you have to remember that the 2008 recession, was a banking crisis.
Right.
So to put a long story short, after the immediate shock, you do have to ease your monetary policy, you do have to have a fiscal stimulus to prevent the economy from freezing. But after that, you could see a lot of, well actually it's after that, the elections after that, you see a talk about tightening the belt. The most typical case, I think, is the UK, when it was the Labour government and the Conservatives on the Labour, and at that time the Liberal Democrats, the three parties were competing, and they're all saying that, look, we're going to cut our deficits. And it was just a matter, the difference was a matter of when they're going to do it. The Conservatives said, right now, as soon as if we gain power, we'll do it right now. The Labour in government, the incumbent Labour Party, the Liberal Democrats said, well, like 6 months later. But the point I want to make is that yes, it does apply. It does apply to a lot of European countries, Germany, France, that was basically carried out as soon as they weathered the initial shock. They turned into a relatively conservative monetary policy and restraint on fiscal policy. And the government, and when the market suspects that the government won't do that or lack the ability to do it, usually the financial markets react in a way that is adversary to the governments themselves, and you can see that in the sovereign debt crisis of Southern Europe and Ireland.
I know in the United States, for instance, you know, it was a big crisis for us, and a lot of new laws were enacted right after the, you know, we refer to it as the crash, actually. So, yeah, I can understand what you're saying.
Much more conservative. Yeah, well, the 2008, you know, the Lehman crisis, etc., really began at the end of the Bush administration and the beginning of the Obama administration. So there's much less presidential initiative leadership because of the transition period and during the election. But if you look at the top, which is the kind of bank bailout program, and then you have a fiscal stimulus after that, it's basically congressional leaders on one hand, you know, adjusting or realizing, and it did take a process of kind of reckoning. So it took 2 votes actually to go through it, but they basically realized, well, you need a big fiscal stimulus. You need to bail out these banks. You need to bail out the auto industries. But as soon as that's over, people start talking about the deficits. And so there was a lot of compromise, as expected, somewhat in my theory, that after that, there's number one, there's this movement towards fiscal restraint, or at least, you know, to deal with the deficit, or the budget deficit in particular. There's more emphasis on monetary easing, and the other thing is that it was really, in many ways, the end result was bipartisan. That, you know, that of both parts probably won't like to admit it, but it was really a compromise on both sides. They didn't want to make the deficit too large, and they didn't want to make it too small. And then by the midterm elections, as you probably know, that there wasn't a second stimulus that President Obama thought that might be necessary, but turned out that the Congress actually opposed that kind of.
Okay. So ultimately, what do you conclude in the paper?
Well, the rosy parties or the optimistic parties. Well, yes, government leaders do tend to give are competent in the way that they do find good solutions. They find solutions that they think can stimulate the economy or bring stable growth, and that that happens regardless of whether you're in the opposition or whether you're an incumbent. If you look across all these countries, that they do, and in elections, especially after the recession, immediately when recession takes place immediately after the recession, they tend to tell you, although in measured terms, that, well, no, these things are necessary, or if you can just read through it, that the voters will recognize that, well, there's tough times coming, So in that sense, that there and the probably the most important thing is that voters still tend to, and this is there's a big question mark on this, but still tend to support these mainstream parties. So the whole notion is that, well, probably grudgingly, voters do accept, well, these are the only solutions, and we'd better elect the person, he or she, who's probably most competent in realizing, implementing these tough measures. That's a good part of it. But there is, of course, the other side is that, well, if you have if you have fiscal austerity, if you have fiscal restraint, that undermines the ability of the states to compensate those who might be hurt by the recession, especially if it's a global recession that might be held not just by the recession itself, but by trade and other issues. And the standard theory goes that, well, governments can figure out ways to compensate these people, to make things a little bit easier, although it's not very easy. But that could undermine, if the recession prolongs for a long time, and this is what you're seeing probably in some European countries. It might be the case in the United States, I'm not really sure about it, but that people might turn to more to easier solutions, or people who are advocating easier solutions, not their competent, that I know what the solution is, I know what the what the best path is, but people say, look, I can see your anger and I can react to that, and I have these simple solutions that could, but they're not actually practical.
Right, and that's the problem.
That's the problem. So you do have, and it's not just the United States. You see that emerging in Europe and other countries.
Well, we saw it in Greece, certainly.
Yes, exactly. But the Greece is a very interesting case, which is not really in this project, but it's an interesting case because when the current Prime Minister came into office, well, he was on a kind of populist platform saying that we're going to renegotiate everything with the European Central Bank, with the EU, but then he kind of turned around and said, look, this is what we really need to do. And that would, that led a lot of voters to, he disappointed a lot of his supporters. But on the other hand, he took this path that would kind of be expected from my framework.
Well, there's never a dull moment in the world economy. Thank you so much for being here and sharing some of your work.
Thank you.
For more information about Professor Hiwatari and his work, please visit our website at macmillanreport.yale.edu. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the MacMillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty MacMillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.